quilting show. Do you remember when we left off last time? We were working on our block-to-block assembly. Well, we want to continue and finish our whole quilt in rows in the same manner, but in this case it's going to be one row to the next row. Imagine if you were making a larger quilt, you would have maybe 4 or 5 blocks in one row, whereas in this one, a small one, I have just 3. It really is important to get all your blocks quilted first and then get your rows assembled. I like to work in a horizontal manner. In other words, get them done going across, and then one row will go to the next row. Remember, we have not put any quilting in this mitered line all the way down here. Of course, there might be quilting in the border. I hope you do have a lot of quilting in the border, but this has been free. Okay, we're going to put row to row in much the same manner. We're going to put the 2 right sides together, and we're going to pin the batting and the backing to the back side. Remember, this is freeing the front border, and in this case it's just like before, only we're working with a longer area, 3 blocks this time. And each time pin it back. I like to put a pin where the mitered corner is and then down here at the end, and then in the same manner come and put a pin in the center, so if there's any distribution to do, it'll be between these 2 areas, here and here. Once that has been all free, I would machine stitch this. That's what's going to give my quilt strength all the way down. Let's pretend that I've already done that, and then I'm going to remove these pins that have been holding that in place, get all of them out, and then once again we're working on a flat surface. Now, if need be, if you would feel better about it, go ahead and remove some of the batting. It would just be like 1/4 of an inch, or it could overlap. It really doesn't make any difference. Then, once again, one side goes straight, the other comes, and you're going to turn under 1/4 of an inch. I like to line up this back seam here. I think that looks quite a bit better, doesn't it? As long as if you can get that on target, if it lines up all the way down. I might mention one thing, of course, all the way down, and do your slip stitching, and that way you can build your quilt 1 row at a time. When your next row of 3 is done, you'll attach those to the existing 2 rows. Okay, I want to mention one thing. Remember the log cabin quilt we were working on? This is going to be done the same way. By the way, if you would be interested in making a log cabin quilt, let me give you the dimensions of this quilt. Remember, I said to start with a 2.5 inch square, and in this case I've added 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows of logs. It takes 36 of these blocks for a king-size bed. That'll kind of give you an idea of how many blocks you have to put together. And the rows, the strips of cloth that you cut out, are 2 inches wide. So that kind of gives you a gauge. All right, block-to-block assembly. I've quilted these 2 blocks. I've put the batting and the backing to the back side. I'm then going to machine stitch all the way down. When I get that done, on the log cabin, I'm going to do something a little bit differently. I'm going to let the batting butt up to each other. One side is going to go straight, and while that side is going that way, I'm going to pin it in place. And then on the front side, I'm going to come over and do a quilting stitch right through here. Do you see what I'll be doing? Then that will be in keeping with the other quilting lines that are on each one of those logs. Then I'll come on the back side and turn that under 1/4 of an inch and do my handwork on the back side. That'll just make it uniform. I'll be able to work and build my whole log cabin quilt in this manner. When I get all the blocks done, you've heard of sunshine and shadows, barn raising, straight furrows. Those are all the different names, the different arrangements that you can do by deciding how you want to place your log cabin together. In other words, if I were going to put all the light in the middle, doesn't that look pretty? This would be the beginning of a barn raising quilt. And I would, of course, decide when all my blocks are quilted how I was going to arrange it. Okay, back to our black and red quilt. I want to mention about finishing off the quilt, your final stitchings on the outside. You're just practically all done now. Remember, you've pre-quilted, then you've put it in rows. One of the first things to wear out in your old quilts that you've got around the house, we have found, is the bias edging. Of course, it gets a lot of wear and tear, but also, years ago, it was just that single edge of edging, the bias tape, and it just wore out. I like to take, and by the way, let me give you this measurement. It's nice. From 1 yard of 45-inch material, you can get about 12 yards of bias tape, and this bias tape is, about 3 to 3.5 inches wide. And I like to take my bias tape. You can also buy it, of course, already prepackaged. If you do, for instance, black would be fun for this quilt. If I bought it already prepackaged, make sure and pre-shrink it. And then iron it flat. Then put your two raw edges together. And of course, this is on the bias. And place it on the right side of your quilt. And then pin it all the way down. I would go all the way. Oh, another thing that I do, I don't like square corners on quilts. It's hard to take this bias edging. I usually take a plate or a cup or something round and just round off the corner of my quilt. It makes it nice and easy to go around with the bias edging. Okay, I'm going to put this all along my quilt, double thickness. So then I will machine stitch all the way down here, and then look how that rolls over, and then by hand I'm going to slip stitch that in place right on top of where, and of course it's going to cover, but right on top of my machine stitching, and that becomes my bias edge. You can see it on just about all the quilts. That's the way I finished them. You've got that double thickness going over. Here's, on this one is the same idea. On this quilt, by the way, I have added two bright borders, and that's something you can do also. The reason, of course, being that you have left, remember, you've left the outside open, haven't you? So you can simply, you've got that for a good seam allowance to add a wide border if you'd like to. Let's move from this one. I wanted to mention ruffles on quilts. They're kind of fun, especially on a small quilt. On the back of this quilt, there are stripes, and I just didn't want to get into matching stripes, so I have alternated the blocks, and of course this takes a little pre-planning when you get ready to arrange them in rows. But notice I have stripes going this way, and then they're going opposite. And what happens is you end up getting even a pattern on the back side of your quilt. On this one, I decided to put a ruffle around the outside of it. I've left one side open here for you to get kind of an idea. Remember, it's been done the same way. It shows up real nicely on this. The white has been machine stitched. Then on this side, the batting butts up next to each other. One goes straight, one turns under 1/4 of an inch. Now, when you have your ruffle all made, it's nice to be able to sew your ruffle to the front side of your border and catch the batting in there. See how that's been caught? Then on this side, all you really need to do is turn that seam allowance in and turn over the back of your quilt and slip stitch that in place. And you've got your ruffle all hidden. I think that's a nice accent, and it certainly softens a quilt, and it'd be fun for a baby quilt also. I'd like to spend a few minutes and kind of give you the gist on how to put a tote bag together. And one reason it's kind of fun is because it just takes 2 of your 12-inch blocks. I like putting a little narrower border on the blocks rather than a 3.5-inch wide. I like to put maybe a 2.5-inch wide border. Remember, this is our drunkard's path pattern. Well, you're simply going to, and in this case you can kind of fudge it a little bit and leave the knots on the back side, because you're going to put a lining in your tote bag and it won't really show, so you don't have to hide your knots. Here's a few strings left here. Put your 2 right sides together, and of course, to do it right, I'd go ahead and use a ruler and draw a good 1/4-inch seam allowance. Sew on 3 sides of your tote bag. Now remember, if you've got a house in the hill block, don't put your house upside down. We wouldn't do that, would we? Okay, then turn it right side out. Push out your corners so they're straight. And then the thing that makes this a tote bag, now we're really almost done then, is to reach back in here and push that through so that we get what is known as a mitered corner. It means holding it with your fingers and coming back in here, and then just on the machine, I'll pin it for now, but on the machine, sew that triangle. It's one of those big dog ears is what it is. Sew across there. That's what's going to enable your tote bag to stand up. The same side over here. Line that up and pin it, and there's your tote bag. Okay, now for the handles on your tote bag, I like to take some of the same fabric that's been on the border and have a nice circular, cut it on the bias. I know in a few minutes that's going to sew on there. Cut yourself a bias, about 2.5 inches wide and maybe about 9 inches long. Sew it, pull it inside out with a big safety pin. Okay? You've got really just a bias tubing. Then get yourself some polyester batting. Of course, you want that to be as long as your tube is going to be, your handle, and cut out a piece of material on the straight of the grain. Sew that on your sewing machine to the batting, okay? Then take a big safety pin and put that in your material. If you didn't secure that material, when you go to pull this through, the batting will just pull apart and you're going to be out of luck. So take it like so, and you can feel that big safety pin and then just pull that all the way down, and before you know it, you're going to have your second handle. Okay, when your handles are all done and the weight you like them, go ahead and machine sew them about where you want them on your tote bag on each side. For instance, one here and one on the other side. For right now, I'm just going to pin it in place, but you'd know there'd be two on each side. Then get yourself a lining. It could be a soft vinyl, it could be a heavy denim, something that you didn't want to show dirt. And I usually cut out a rectangle, the same width, of course, of two of the sides. And then I pin it all the way around to the tote bag, letting a little bit overlap at the seam allowance, knowing that in a few minutes, when this comes all the way around, you are then going to machine stitch your side seam, all right? This is going to come this way. See how those are going to meet there? I know that's where I want that seam allowance to go. So before I did anything else, I'd sew that on the machine all the way down. Then I'm going to come and I will machine stitch the top all the way around here. And once I have done that, I can take my lining and turn it inside. It's going to fall right inside. You're going to have to kind of imagine this along with me here. And then, of course, that wouldn't show. And then there's your tote bag with the little floral lining inside. And that's kind of fun to do with just two blocks. It could be a sampler. They could be Drunkard's Path on one side and something else on the other side. You could even do the same thing with, say, a strawberry print. And by the way, I wanted to mention this. There are so many pretty prints on the market. If you want to kind of experiment and kind of learn how to lap quilt without making a patchwork block, buy yourself some pretty material. Layer the 3 layers, put a border on, and just lap quilt. Go around all the strawberries, and we can kind of call this a mock trapunto, can't we? Because then all of a sudden it gets puffy, and we haven't had to slit open the back side and stuff anything in because the batting's already there. But this is the beginning of another little tote bag. 2 different kinds of strawberries on each side. Let's go to the sewing machine and talk about crazy patch. It really is appropriate, I believe, to end with crazy patch because in many ways it's so nice to think of when you get all of your blocks put together, the little tiny scraps that are left over, for instance, they're just little tiny ones, those are the ones that then are going to go in your crazy patch block. We want to remember back that one of the first quilt blocks that were ever made with a crazy patch, and it was a block that was really born out of necessity because when a blanket had worn out and cloth was so scarce and it was hard to come by and they had to patch a blanket or something, that was the original crazy patch. I'd like to talk, there are many different forms of crazy patch, and you have probably always thought, well, maybe they just take those little random pieces of leftover material and just sew them together by hand. Well, it's not that way, and the way they used to do it years ago, we still do today. And the way that it's done is to work on a foundation piece of material. And in this case, make sure it's on the straight of the grain, and I would cut out a 12.5-inch piece of foundation material, knowing when you finish, your 12-inch block is going to go on the back side. Now with crazy patch, you can either start in the center or you can start in one corner. That's entirely up to you. Maybe you've got a particular piece you want to center and start in the middle. The idea years ago was that you would put a piece down and then another piece would maybe butt up right next to it. And you'd turn the raw edge of that, for instance, that yellow piece under and slide that underneath and you'd pin it in place. And then pretty soon, with some embroidery thread, you'd come over and you'd do a stitch, maybe a fin and feather, or a buttonhole stitch, or a chevron stitch on top of that. And that would be, you would keep building block after block like this, and pretty soon you'd sew these blocks together. Well, today, we've updated crazy patch a little bit. We do the same idea. We work on a foundation piece, but we use a sewing machine, and it really makes it nice. For instance, if I start with this yellow piece in the corner, I will then put my 2 right sides together, and I'm going to machine stitch through both of my little remnant pieces of material. but I'm catching the foundation piece underneath. So on the back side, I can see the machine stitching, and on the front side, it's a matter of sewing and then flipping. Do you see how I've done that? And I usually thumb crease it right there, and I'll put a pin in right after that. Then I'll pick up another piece and just kind of work around and see what I've got left over here. Maybe a little check piece would be nice. Same idea. Line that up, sew, and flip. It's just a matter of filling up this whole area by sewing and flipping, putting the two right sides together, sew and flip. When I do that, I've got the back side for a guide for trimming off, don't I? That's what I'm going to use to trim off. And when I get all finished, now here's one you can kind of examine and see how I've done it here. You can tell in this one, all a potpourri of colors, all different sort of things. It doesn't really form any mode, whereas in this one, it's all the brown leftovers, isn't it? It's all the different kind of brown, and the whole theme that was in this quilt I've stuck to, but in this one, it's any color, and it's just a matter of using a good sense of balance and going all the way out. Now, sometimes you're going to get what we call up the creek, and that does happen. For instance, right here, I'm going to have to slip stitch that in place and then come back and put an embroidery stitch on it. You can kind of, even the vest I have on, you can kind of get an idea. It was done the same way with Crazy Patch. And the secret in doing it with clothes is to cut out your muslin foundation first. For instance, even in a jacket that's a blazer like this that has all sorts of pieces to it, you would cut out the pattern pieces in muslin and then build all the leftover soft denims in the same manner on that pattern piece. After your whole muslin piece is filled up, then put your darts in, add your embroidery stitches. This is what, of course, makes it important, and this is what it makes it looks like from the naked eye that you have put this whole garment together with these fun embroidery stitches. But you haven't. You've come back afterwards and put the embroidery stitches on the Crazy Patch. This, by using the machine, it makes it stronger, and I feel it will last a little bit longer. I've been having kind of a fun idea by taking leftover denim material and working on the same Crazy Patch way. And this happens to be a friend of mine. Her son is going to college this year, and I decided to make him a quilt. And she has been saving all of his blue jean denim material, all of the cut-offs from 4 years of high school, and we are putting those into a quilt. She's helping me embroider a couple of the blocks, so it'll be kind of personalized. And I can show you one block that's already been done. It'll kind of give you an idea of what it'll look like. Here's part of a strap of some overalls. But I've done it in the same way, and in this case, I've used a leftover mattress pad. It is pretty worn, but it's still good, so we washed it and laundered it, and it has the weight of a soft felt quilting or batting material, and then just taken all the pieces and put them on random, the same idea, placed them in. For instance, we could start with something like this in the middle, and then if you've got a long line here, I'm going to put the two right sides together, machine sew and flip, machine sew and flip. You can look at the back side of this block and see the machine stitching, and you know that's going to make it strong. So we're making 12 of these, and when they're done, we'll simply sew them block to block. And then I'll cut out probably maybe a plaid backing of just a cotton blend material, and then tack this quilt with some yarn. So it really won't be quilted from the back side, but it'll certainly be heavy and be worn, and it'll be kind of sentimental. It'll be something that he's probably familiar with most of the jeans. So that's another thing to do with the leftover material and adapting it to the Crazy Patch block. Another thing that you might be interested in doing is your Dresden Plate. It's a very old pattern, and as we said earlier, quite often it's been called the friendship ring because it took a whole lot of friends to give you all the leftover material. And I have kind of a fun way to do it in that I like to keep the curves just all, instead of doing the scallop all the way around the outside, I like to just keep the curves turned under. I think it makes it nice. There are 16 pieces, of course, one pattern. And remember how we connected everything together and sewed in our little assembly line on the machine. Then go ahead and cut these all apart, and then you would be sewing in 4s, wouldn't you? If you've gotten 2s done, you're going to get in 4 sewn together, and then those 4 would go together and you'd have half, and pretty soon you're going to have your ring all completed. Now this is a form of applique, and of course applique is one thing we haven't had time to really get into, but in this case we want to turn under the raw edges, and then we're going to applique or slip stitch this to a foundation piece of material. In other words, this could be a block in your quilt. In this case, it's gone into a handbag, and it's got a block on 3 parts of your handbag. I like to take, once I have appliqued it on there, take my blue pen and make a little embroidery or just a running stitch around the end of each one of the Dresden plates. It gives it a nice scallop look, and you haven't had to turn under all those raw edges, which is kind of a nuisance. But that's your Dresden plate. Also, remember, press all your seams going in one direction. See how nice that makes it easy for then quilting just on the one side where your seam is not, okay? I'd like to give you one other little tip about a grandmother's fan block that really is a nice little tip. The grandmother fan kind of combines the Dresden plate and the drunkard's path, because we have this shape. This looks kind of like our Dresden plate, and in this case there are just 8 of these pieces. So when you get them sewn together in 2s, then it's this half going to this half, and this is then placed on a foundation piece of material, and your drunkard's path like curve will be sewn into this part of your grandmother's fan. Now, this is a nice thing to know about if you were, say, not only the top of a grandmother's fan, but the bottom of a little Dutch girl's dress. If you were going to put, you've got your raw edge going up, put your rickrack on and let it fall on top, then machine stitch, and I'll do a little bit more, right in the middle of that rickrack, all right? Come all the way down. Of course, I wouldn't go all the way across because I don't have all 8 of them sewn together yet. But once you have machine stitched, then when you turn that back, you're not only turning your raw edge under, you're also revealing your rickrack at the same time. It makes it very nice. When you get this block all done, I like to pretend this has been sewn to it and this half has been done. I like to place this on the foundation piece, and then here's a place to do that little slip in the ditch, right in the corner there where that rickrack connects. Go ahead and just work all the way down and secure that to your foundation piece, and this becomes then another block to put in your quilt, or known as your grandmother's fan. There was one other little block. Oh, this is kind of fun. This is a form of the crazy patch, and this is a form of crazy patch also. It's called an old string quilt, and years ago something like this, it's hard to tell right now. It looks like a kaleidoscope, doesn't it, of all the different colors, but all these little leftovers were actually built on a piece of newspaper. And when I bought this quilt top, I had to even pick some of the pieces of newspaper off the back, and but that was the foundation for building this scrap or this string quilt. But it sure has a folk look, and it's kind of a fun quilt. The same idea could be done today, only using the muslin, and it would give maybe a firmer foundation. This is the beginning of a diamond wall hanging that'll be a star, a Lemoyne star. And notice how just taking the leftover silks, and in this case I placed it down here first, sewed and flip, sew and flip. You can look down here and see the same idea of taking it and just sewing and flip, sew and flip. And of course, to complete it, I'll put some embroidery stitches each place where I've had the seam join. Let's take a few minutes now to go to the rocking chair. It has really been my pleasure to be with you in this lap quilting series. I've really enjoyed it. I think hopefully you have learned something. You can experiment, try new things. You can do it yourself. There are projects galore available for you to do. We can maybe look at this as kind of a quilt appreciation class, and maybe just a sewing appreciation class. Just think of the 4 mothers who have set the stage, the legacy and the heritage that they have handed down to us in this wonderful craft. Thank you.
To receive a copy of Georgia's Guide to Lap Quilting, simply send $5 to Lap Quilting, Post Office Box 96, Flat Rock, North Carolina 28731.